So on the last video, we left off with kind of a brief introduction to the differences between sympathetic and parasympathetic. And I mentioned that basically all organs are inputted by both sympathetic and parasympathetic. And usually that's doing opposite things. So for example, the sympathetic division may dilate the pupil and the parasympathetic division constricts the pupil. So two opposite things. There are, of course, a few exceptions, and we'll go through each of those right now. So the first, this is my example here with the eye. So you can see normally it's having information coming in from the sympathetic and the parasympathetic to do opposite things, dilating or constricting the pupil. Okay. The first example of an exception is sympathetic only. So the adrenal medulla is a little gland that sits on top of your kidneys, and it secretes epinephrine or adrenaline. Clever name, adrenal from adrenaline. And the only thing that can happen with this is secretion of epinephrine. So sympathetic nervous system will tell the adrenal medulla to secrete epinephrine. The parasympathetic system does not innervate the adrenal medulla at all. Okay, the other example here, sweat glands. So sympathetic nervous system tells your sweat glands, secrete sweat. And then a lot of your blood vessels are vasoconstricted, which is shrunk. They get smaller. Okay, so all these things only can do one thing. Like you can't not stimulate secretion. Or suppose you could inhibit it, but you don't need to inhibit it because it's either on or nothing. Parasympathetic only is also an option. Examples there in red, you don't need to worry about them, but same kind of idea. They're just secreting. Lacrimal glands secrete tears, nasal glands secrete mucus. And then the third option is cooperative control. So they're working together to produce the same effect. So for example, salivation, the peripheral nervous system parasympathetic nervous system will tell you to secrete like a watery saliva versus sympathetic gets a little mucousy. So if you notice while you're running or exercising, your saliva gets a little bit thicker. That's because of stimulation from your sympathetic nervous system. Okay, take a second, pause, look at these questions, and then we'll go through the answers. So the fight or flight response is a result of sympathetic. And the thing that's missing here, skeletal muscles. So in the autonomic nervous system, on both sympathetic and parasympathetic, we'll see a 2-neuron chain. And that just means there are 2 neurons in a chain before they get to the effector organ. So for example, here on the bottom, you can see this circle. That's a cell body in the brain or the spinal cord. And it's sending out its axon. These are its synaptic knobs. This is a synaptic cleft. And then this is a second neuron cell body, second neuron axon, synaptic knob, neurotransmitters, and then this is the effector. So it takes 2 neurons in order to get to the effector. Okay, so this, where they synapse, is called the ganglion. So we call the nerve before that preganglionic, and then we call the nerve after that postganglionic. So preganglionic and postganglionic. Preganglionic neuron is myelinated, postganglionic neuron is not myelinated. And we'll go through details on the differences here on a drawing in the next video. So this slide is just comparing what you guys already learned as somatic innervation. So this is with your muscles. So there's one neuron. It has one cell body, sends one long myelinated axon, and it secretes acetylcholine, and that causes muscle contraction. One single neuron. In the autonomic nervous system, we have that preganglionic neuron, the ganglion, and then a postganglionic neuron to meet with the effector. In this case, it was the heart. You may also hear them referred to as presynaptic and postsynaptic. Those are interchangeable with preganglionic and postganglionic. So here, we're looking at just sympathetic nervous system. So in the sympathetic nervous system, we use this system called the sympathetic chain ganglia, which is a term on your terms list for this lab practical. And this is where the nerves synapse. So there will be one nerve from the brain or spinal cord to the sympathetic chain ganglion. And then the other neuron will start in the sympathetic chain ganglion and it will go to the organ. Okay? Sympathetic nervous system neurons originate in the thoracic and the lumbar regions of the spinal cord. In the parasympathetic division, the cell bodies are in the brain or in the sacrum, and they use a different mechanism of the ganglia. So they send out a really long first neuron, and then they synapse pretty close to the actual target organ, and I'll go through that later. There's one cranial nerve that I really want you to know, part of the parasympathetic division, and it's called the vagus nerve. We call it cranial nerve 10. On your lab practical, you'll see a question with the cranial nerves. So vagus means wandering, so this nerve starts in the brain, and it goes kind of throughout the whole organ systems, basically all of these, and it is 90% of all your parasympathetic fibers. So when the parasympathetic nervous system is being activated, most of that is because of cranial nerve 10, the vagus nerve. So here in the parasympathetic nervous system, you can see all these different cranial nerves with the Roman numerals. These are all parasympathetic and they're all going to different organs. I don't care that you know the super specifics of this, but just kind of keep this in mind. Okay, so on average, one preganglionic sympathetic neuron splits to innervate 17 postganglionic fibers. What is this arrangement called, and why would we use a system? So pause, think about the questions, and then we'll go through the answer. So this arrangement where one neuron splits to innervate 17 others is called divergence. Convergence would be the opposite, where 17 neurons control one. And then the sympathetic nervous system uses this because it allows you to activate multiple organs all at once, and it allows you to have a response kind of throughout the whole body. So now we're going to go through a chart looking at comparisons between the sympathetic and parasympathetic division. This chart you'll probably see on a worksheet, on your assignment, and probably on an exam. So I highly recommend knowing and understanding this. And I'll do a drawing online that's similar to this. So first, we're trying to decide which system is parasympathetic or sympathetic. So the short preganglionic neuron tells us that this is the sympathetic division. So this top part is all sympathetic. And then the long preganglionic neuron shows it's parasympathetic. The sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions each use neurotransmitters to communicate. In both of the preganglionic neurons, they secrete acetylcholine. In the postganglionic neurons, the sympathetic division uses norepinephrine, and the parasympathetic division uses acetylcholine. So here is showing, these little red question marks are showing, asking, oh, what neurotransmitter is being used. So we said acetylcholine was used in both preganglionic neurons, and then we said norepinephrine was used in sympathetic, and acetylcholine was used in parasympathetic. If we go down, there's a neurotransmitter, but what is the receptor? What is the ligand-gated receptor called? So there are multiple different types of receptors. So cholinergic receptors bind to acetylcholine, and there are two different types. So the first are called nicotinic, which you're probably familiar, like nicotine. These are going to be found in all postganglionic cell bodies, so the soma of the postsynaptic neuron. These open sodium-potassium channels. And then the other type of cholinergic receptors are muscarinic, and they're going to be found on the effector cell membrane, so like on the membrane of the pancreas, for example. They're linked to a secondary messenger system and are found in parasympathetic pathways. Okay, so we know that these are both nicotinic receptors, and then we'll go through the other types of receptors. So adrenergic receptors bind to epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are linked to second messenger systems. Okay, so here on the effector cell membrane, this alpha beta is because there are multiple different subtypes of adrenergic receptors. If you've heard of like beta blockers, we'll go through that in a little bit. So those are those receptors. And then on the effector cell membrane of parasympathetic, these are called muscarinic receptors. So those are the other acetylcholine receptors. Okay, so I'm going to stop here and I'm going to do a drawing online for you to check out to try and explain this in a different way for you.